Number 8. The Bystander Bonfire. Imagine you're sitting in a room, filling out a very, very important questionnaire about your favorite type of cheese. Suddenly, smoke starts pouring in from under the door. Not a little puff, but thick, acrid, "Houston, we have a problem" smoke. You look around. The two other people in the room with you just keep filling out their forms. They glance at the smoke, shrug, and go back to debating the merits of Gouda versus provolone. What do? Do you scream, run for the door, or do you sit there quietly suffocating because you don't want to be the one to make a scene? In 1968, psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley decided to test this exact scenario because apparently they suspected humanity was doomed by its own awkwardness. They put participants in a room, either alone or with two other people who were secretly actors. Then they pumped in fake smoke. When a participant was alone, 75% of them reported the smoke almost immediately. They saw a problem and reacted. But when they were in a room with two actors who were specifically instructed to ignore the smoke, only 10% of the real participants did anything at all. The other 90% sat there, rubbing their eyes, coughing, and presumably re-evaluating all their life choices as the room filled with what looked like a vape convention gone wrong. This chilling little experiment gave us the bystander effect. It's not that people are monsters who want to watch the world burn. It's that our brains are deeply, pathologically afraid of being the weird one. We see a crisis. We look to others for cues. And if they're all acting like nothing is wrong, our brain goes, well, I guess dying in a fire is the polite thing to do here. Wouldn't want to overreact. It's a phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance, where everyone privately thinks there's an emergency, but publicly acts calm because everyone else is acting calm. Basically, we're all trapped in a social feedback loop of not wanting to be the first person to yell, "Fire!" in a crowded and very much on fire theater. Number 7. The Summer Camp from Hell. What's the fastest way to make a group of 11-year-old boys hate each other with the fire of 1,000 suns? According to psychologist Muzafer Sharif, all you have to do is give them matching t-shirts and a tug-of-war rope. In 1954, he conducted the Robbers Cave experiment, a study that sounds less like science and more like the plot of a very dark Lord of the Flies reboot. Sharif trucked two groups of carefully selected, well-adjusted boys out to a summer camp. Let them bond with their own groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and then introduce them to each other. The goal was to see how quickly tribalism and intergroup conflict could be manufactured from scratch. The answer? Almost instantly. As soon as the groups knew about each other, they started hurling insults. Then, Sharif introduced a series of competitions with prizes for the winners and nothing for the losers. This is when things went completely off the rails. The boys ransacked each other's cabins, burned each other's flags, and started stockpiling rocks for what was shaping up to be a full-scale preteen brawl. They went from happy campers to pint-sized warlords in a matter of days. The creepy part isn't just how easily the conflict was created, but how Sharif fixed it. He tried getting them together for fun activities, which only resulted in food fights. The only thing that worked was introducing a superordinate goal, a problem so big they had to work together to solve it. Their water supply was sabotaged, and a truck delivering their food broke down. Suddenly, the Eagles and Rattlers were no longer enemies. They were just a bunch of kids trying to solve a problem. The experiment proved that the easiest way to create hatred is to create competition over scarce resources. And the easiest way to create unity is to convince everyone that the bus is stuck in the mud, and they'll all starve if they don't push it out together. It's a terrifyingly simple recipe for both war and peace. Number 6. The Monster Study. In 1939, at the University of Iowa, a psychologist named Wendell Johnson decided he wanted to figure out what causes stuttering. This is a noble goal. His methods, however, were not. Johnson had a theory that stuttering wasn't a physical problem, but a learned behavior caused by anxiety and negative feedback. So, he designed an experiment to test this, and for his subjects, he chose 22 orphans from a nearby institution. Because, ethics were more of a suggestion back then. He split the children into two groups. The first group consisted of kids who already had a stutter. They were told over and over again that their speech was perfectly fine, that they were good speakers, and that they should ignore anyone who said otherwise. The second group was the horrifying one. It was made up of children who spoke perfectly normally. These kids were systematically told that they had a stutter. The researchers would point out every normal hesitation, every pause for breath, and label it as a symptom of a developing speech impediment. They were told, You show many of the symptoms of a child who is beginning to stutter. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Don't ever speak unless you can do it right. Silwa. The results were as heartbreaking as you'd expect. The children who were praised for their speech actually became more confident, and, in some cases, their stutters improved. But the children who were told they were broken, they developed the exact problems the researchers were pretending they had. These perfectly fluent children became anxious, self-conscious, and reluctant to speak. Several of them developed lifelong speech and psychological problems. The experiment was so monstrously unethical that it was hidden away for decades, and Johnson's colleagues who knew about it dubbed it the monster study. It proved that if you tell a child they're broken enough times, you can, in fact, break them. Number 5. The dogs who gave up. Picture this. A dog is placed in a cage with a floor that delivers a mild but unpleasant electric shock. There's a lever inside. If the dog presses the lever, the shock stops. Most dogs figure this out pretty quickly. They learn they have control. Now picture a second dog in an identical cage. The shock starts, but this dog's lever doesn't do anything. The shocks are random and inescapable. No matter what the dog does, press the lever, bark, run in circles. The pain just keeps coming. After a while, the dog just lies down. It gives up. It accepts that suffering is inevitable. This was the setup for Martin Seligman's infamous 1967 experiments on learned helplessness. But it gets worse. Seligman then took the dogs from the second group, the ones who had learned that nothing they did mattered, and put them in a new cage. This cage had a low barrier in the middle. One side was electrified, the other was safe. All the dogs had to do was jump over the little wall to escape the shock. The dogs from the first group, the ones who had learned they had control, figured this out instantly. But the dogs who had learned helplessness, they didn't even try. They just lay down on the electrified floor and whimpered, accepting the shock even when escape was right in front of them. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to believe they were powerless that they couldn't recognize an opportunity to save themselves. This experiment was foundational in understanding depression and trauma in humans. It showed that when you're repeatedly exposed to a stressful situation you can't control, your brain can learn to just stop trying. You start to believe that failure is inevitable and that your actions are meaningless, even when circumstances change. It's the voice in your head that says, "Why bother?" after a few setbacks. It's a ghost of a cruel experiment, reminding us that the most dangerous cage is the one your brain builds for itself after being told it has no way out. Number 4. The Scaredy-Cat Baby. Ever wonder if you were born afraid of spiders? Or if some guy in a lab coat with a questionable mustache just made you that way? Well, in 1920, behaviorist John B. Watson wanted to find out. And he did so by performing an experiment on a 9-month-old infant known to history as Little Albert, which is a far too adorable name for the subject of such a sinister study. Watson wanted to prove that fear was a conditioned response, not an innate emotion. In other words, he wanted to see if he could program a phobia into a human being. The experiment started innocently enough. They presented Little Albert with a series of objects: a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, and even a Santa Claus mask. Albert was a chill baby. He was curious and unafraid of all of them. Then the fun began. They brought out the white rat again. This time, as soon as Albert reached for it, Watson snuck up behind him and slammed a steel bar with a hammer, creating a terrifyingly loud clang. The baby naturally burst into tears. They did this again and again. Rat, clang, rat, clang. It didn't take long. Soon, the mere sight of the white rat was enough to make little Albert cry and desperately try to crawl away. Watson had successfully installed a phobia, but it didn't stop there. The fear generalized. Albert became terrified of the rabbit, the dog, a fur coat, cotton wool, even the Santa Claus mask. Anything white and fluffy was now a source of pure terror. Watson had taken a perfectly happy baby and turned him into a bundle of conditioned anxiety. The worst part? Albert's mother pulled him from the study before Watson could decondition him. So, this poor child was sent back out into the world with a freshly installed, scientifically proven fear of nice, soft things. It's a landmark study that taught us so much about how phobias work. And also that early 20th century scientists apparently used the same moral compass as a cartoon supervillain. Number 3. The just following orders machine. You're in a university lab. A man in a gray technician's coat tells you that you're part of a learning experiment. Your job is to be the teacher. In another room, a learner is strapped to a chair with electrodes on his wrists. Every time the learner gets a question wrong, you have to flip a switch that delivers an electric shock. The shock generator in front of you has 30 switches, starting at 15 volts, labeled slight shock, and going all the way up to 450 volts, labeled with a sinister XXX. With each wrong answer, you have to increase the voltage. This was the Stanley Milgram experiment in 1961. The learner was an actor. The shocks were fake. The only real subject was you, the teacher. Milgram wanted to know how far an ordinary person would go in obeying an authority figure when the orders conflicted with their conscience. As the voltage increases, the actor in the other room starts to grunt in pain. At 120 volts, he shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150, he demands to be let out of the experiment. At 300, he screams in agony and complains about his heart condition. After 330 volts, he goes completely silent. If you hesitate, the man in the lab coat calmly says, "Please continue," or "The experiment requires that you continue." How far do you think you'd go? Most people say they'd stop early on. The chilling reality? Nearly 2/3 of the participants, 65%, went all the way to the maximum 450 volts. They were sweating, trembling, and protesting, but they kept flipping the switches all the way to the end, simply because a guy in a coat told them to. Milgram proved that it's not just evil monsters who do terrible things. It's ordinary people, like you and me, who can be coaxed into cruelty by a perceived authority figure and a diffusion of responsibility. Your brain simply outsources its moral judgment to the guy who looks like he's in charge, even if he's telling you to do something you know is profoundly wrong. It's the psychological equivalent of saying, "I was just following orders." Number 2. The cardboard prison. What happens when you put good people in an evil place? Do the people triumph, or does the place win? In 1971, Stanford psychologist Philip Zimbardo decided to find out by building a fake prison in the basement of the psychology department. He recruited 24 mentally healthy, well-adjusted male college students, flipped a coin, and designated half as prisoners and half as guards. The prisoners were arrested by real police at their homes, fingerprinted, and brought to the mock prison, where they were stripped and given numbered smocks to wear. The guards were given khaki uniforms, reflective sunglasses to hide their eyes, and wooden batons. Zimbardo told them their job was to maintain order, but gave them no specific rules. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It lasted 6 days. Things deteriorated with terrifying speed. On the very first night, the guards, who were just ordinary college kids hours earlier, began to psychologically harass the prisoners. By the second day, the prisoners staged a rebellion, barricading their cell doors with their beds. The guards responded with overwhelming force, spraying them with fire extinguishers, stripping them naked, and putting the ringleaders in solitary confinement, a dark closet. The guards became increasingly sadistic, inventing cruel and humiliating punishments. They forced prisoners to do push-ups with a guard's foot on their back, refused to let them use the toilet, and made them sing songs and chant their numbers. They weren't just playing a role, they became the role. The prisoners, in turn, became passive, helpless, and emotionally broken. Several had to be released within the first few days due to extreme psychological distress. The whole thing was called off early when Zimbardo's girlfriend, another psychologist, visited the prison and was horrified by what she saw, pointing out that he had created a genuinely abusive environment. The Stanford prison experiment became a terrifying lesson in the power of the situation. It suggests that the line between good and evil is terrifyingly permeable, and that a uniform and a little bit of power are sometimes all it takes to turn a regular person into a petty tyrant. Number 1. The mother made of wire. For a long time, psychologists believed that babies only bonded with their mothers for one simple reason: food. The mother provides milk, the baby survives, and that transactional relationship creates attachment. It was a cold, clinical view of love. Then came Harry Harlow, a psychologist who, in the 1950s, decided to test this theory with a series of experiments so profoundly cruel and depressing, they make all the others on this list look like a pleasant day at the park. Harlow took infant rhesus monkeys away from their mothers just hours after birth and raised them in isolation. In their cages, he placed 2 surrogate mothers. One was a cold, hard figure made of wire mesh, but it had a bottle of milk attached to it. The other was a figure made of soft terry cloth, offering warmth and comfort, but no food. According to the old theory, the baby monkeys should have bonded with the wire mother. That's not what happened. The infant monkeys spent nearly all their time clinging desperately to the soft cloth mother. They would only dash over to the wire mother for a quick drink of milk before immediately returning to the comfort of the cloth one. When scared, they ran to the cloth mother for security, not the one that fed them. Harlow proved that attachment isn't about food. It's about what he called contact comfort. Sake salt. This alone would be a landmark study. But Harlow didn't stop there. He wanted to see what would happen if he created a perfect model of depression. He built a device he called the Pit of Despair, an isolation chamber where a monkey would be trapped alone in the dark for up to a year. The monkeys that emerged were psychologically destroyed. They were catatonic, stared blankly, and were incapable of interacting with other monkeys. They had been utterly and completely broken. Harlow's work was monstrous, but it revolutionized our understanding of love, attachment, and the critical importance of comfort and affection in early development. It proved that love is a biological necessity, and that a life without it is barely a life at all. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.